Okay, looks like I am starting without them. In love with history. It's a wonderful title. And I really am in love with history. And people think I'm a historian. And I'm not at all. I was a school teacher, but I taught English. But I grew up in Scotland at a time where I had some brilliant teachers who got me fascinated in two things: the Arthurian legend and the Roman occupation of Britain. People don't realize that in Britain, the Romans they occupied Britain for 450 years, right? 460 years. That's as long as the English-speaking peoples have been in North America. So Britain, in those days, at the turn of the 5th century, was thoroughly Roman, completely, totally. But it also had 400 years worth of development. My God, that was nice to watch. They've had 400 years of development of this hybrid people who were called the Romano-British. And they were neither flesh nor fowl. They weren't Roman, and they certainly weren't Celtic. They weren't clansmen. So, okay, sorry about that. I would like to introduce you to...
My name is Adrienne Kerr. Jack and I know each other very well.
I was just looking for the perfect thing there, but she got in ahead of me. So we're going to just take questions from you. Did you find her?
I didn't. Is this on? Yes.
Yeah,
okay.
it's just very low.
I've got someone looking for her in the lobby, but I think maybe she thinks she's done.
Yeah, she may.
Yes. And she said goodbye to Jack, not realizing that.
My head wasn't there at the time, so...
It's been a long con.
Yeah, it has.
So yes, I think we'll take questions.
All right, I'm up for that.
Please ask some questions.
Yeah.
Tim.
Directed specifically towards Adrienne as the editor, are there areas of historical fiction that you would like to see? Jack mentioned Arthurian legends, and I'm not saying it's been done to death, but it's done a lot. Are there areas that you're thinking, that's fascinating, I wish we knew more about Cleopatra's uncle, or whatever it may be? Is there something you're seeing?
No, in fact, I never have a laundry list. It always comes down to the words on the page, the manuscript, and how original and transporting it is. I don't have a laundry list.
But I do. My next project that I'm contemplating right now started out as a one-novel prequel to the first novel in my Arthurian series, which was 5th century Britain. But now I'm going back to 4th century Britain. And in my incidental reading for it, I discovered that there's all kinds of fascinating stuff about when my protagonist would have been alive and his father was alive. Diocletian was the emperor, and he conducted the last great scourge, the last great persecution of the Christians, and he was followed directly by Constantine the Great, who recognized Christianity as an official religion and then altered it forever, changed it from early Christianity to what we now call Roman Catholicism. Fascinating stuff and incredible people, because in part of my reading on Diocletian, I discovered that it was alleged, but has never been proven, that he murdered 3 other emperors in order to claim the imperial throne. There's got to be a story there, God. And so that's where I'm going next, into 4th century Britain, which nobody writes about. So, 4th century Italy and Britain. So, yes.
Do you think it's more difficult when treating an area of the past that has so much research to it, and perhaps taking a character out of that past? I'm thinking specifically of yesterday when you were reading in the historical slush session manuscript page that started out with Julius Caesar.
Yes.
And clearly Caesar was supposed to be...
No, it wasn't Julius Caesar, it was Gaius Julius. Yeah.
But in any case, a character that is very well established in both history and literature.
Yes.
Is there more of a challenge taking that kind of character and then weaving a story around that central protagonist than there would be otherwise taking a more marginal character?
I can answer.
Please.
The question is, does it become more difficult dealing with a character for whom we have historical evidence rather than inventing a character? And the answer is very, very definitely yes. Because in my early books, I was dealing with the Arthurian legend. I was in 5th century Britain. There are no written records. So I could proceed under just my storyteller's steam. Most recently, I've been working with Robert the Bruce and William Wallace 700 years ago. And I got to be extremely careful, both in my research and in what I extrapolate from that research, because I can't just go ahead as I did with my first book and say, oh, on Tuesday the 14th of September, he got involved in a fight in Largs in Scotland, if I'm talking about Robert Bruce. Because there's a record somewhere that tells exactly what Bruce was doing on that day at that time and where he was. So the research, the authenticity of the history becomes far more restrictive and restricting. So the closer you get to modern times, the greater the amount of records you have to study in order to maintain that accuracy. Yeah, David.
So how much research would you do for something like your Robert Bruce?
Bloody tons. Like 70 years. I grew up over there. Yeah, I was force-fed this stuff when I was 5 years old.
The stuff you were force-fed, how much of it is accurate to the history text and how much of it is passed down orally that may have been altered?
In 1997, the movie Braveheart took the world by storm. And a classic example of how wishful thinking can influence the course of history, or warp it, because it was not historically accurate. It was drawn from a poem called The Wallace that was written by a blind poet called Blind Harry 150 years after Wallace had died. So you've got the memory of one man who is by definition a liar because he's a professional bard and poet. How accurate can it be? Well, I'll tell you how accurate it was. The girl that Wallace seduced, or she seduced him, the princess who whispered in King Edward's ear as he was dying that she was pregnant with William Wallace's baby, and he gasped, gurgled, and croaked. She didn't meet her husband, his son, Edward's son, until 9 years after Wallace was dead. So there's historical accuracy for you. That's Hollywood. And so you got to be right spot on when you're doing these kind of things. And what was it? I'd forgotten your question.
Just about the volume of actual record checking and stuff like that you have to do when you're...
Oh, lots. And as I said, I grew up... I was going to tell you that in the next 3 years after the launch of Braveheart, everybody thought that William Wallace was Mel Gibson. They put a statue of Mel Gibson as William Wallace at the base of Wallace's monument, and it stood there for about 3 years before somebody smartened up and pulled it away. But it was Mel Gibson. 3 years after that, an event that had been awaited for years came along, and it was the opening of the National Museum of Scotland. So it had been happening for 20 years, and all of a sudden they opened the doors and the place was jammed. It was mobbed. The National Museum of Scotland, there was not one word mentioning Robert or William Wallace in the whole museum. Not a word. Not an article, not an artifact. And they practically had a revolution on their hands. And then the truth came out. For the last 600 years, Wallace has been lionized. Jesus Christ's all right, but William Wallace is God. That was the attitude in Scotland. And so academic historians became totally incapable of deciphering the man who was from the legend that had grown up around him. And so rather than commit seppuku publicly in their professions, they chose to say nothing. And for 150 years prior to the opening of that museum, there had been nothing academic stated about William Wallace. And so he was not included in the museum. That event launched a completely brand new study of Wallace and what we did have about him. It was approached suddenly anew using scientific methods of inquiry that hadn't existed 150 years ago, and technology that had not existed. And what they have discovered about William Wallace is absolutely astounding. They found out that the reason he was supposed to be a giant, he wasn't a giant in stature, he was a giant in girth, because he was a trained longbowman who started practicing the English longbow when he was about 10 years old, and for the next 15, 16 years, he was a practicing archer. These guys can pull a 250-pound bow and fire. Aim and fire. They can do it 6 times a minute, and they could keep it up for 15 minutes at a stretch before they had to take a break. They unearthed a grave in Agincourt about, I think it was 9 years ago, maybe 11 years ago. And in it were the skeletons of 5 English archers. Now, at the Battle of Agincourt, how the hell did they know they were archers? They just found some bones. They found bones that were so deformed, they had great, huge hooks, spurs of bone growing out of them, and those spurs were there to anchor the ropes of muscle that they needed in their arms, back, and shoulders to pull those bows. And great things that were like 2 inches long, just to anchor those enormous muscles, shoulder muscles. And so William Wallace was a bowman, he was an archer, and he was a longbow-man, and he was a giant, not up, but out and across. That's the kind of stuff that I found out when I was writing research in the Forest Laird. Boom. And his personal insignia, which has always been there, is a longbow, fully drawn with an arrow attached. That was his personal crest, yes.
Well, first of all, I learned about your books when I brought a roommate into my life who was the King of Scotland.
Okay.
Donald Bruce and the great-grandson of Robert Bruce. But besides that, how did you come up with the concept of the Skystone? I mean, that is so, when you read it, it totally makes sense. Now you get the idea that this could be a super weapon. But where did that come from?
I don't know. It came because I had spent my entire life to that point resenting and getting very angry over the fact that when it came to the central nut, the kernel at the center of the Arthurian legend, nobody could give me an explanation of how it happened. How did the sword get into that stone, and how was that kid able to pull it out without magic? Because I don't believe in magic. And one day, I realized I knew how it was done. And I recognized it because I had witnessed an analogous demonstration when I was a young kid. I was about 6 years old because I was in grade 1. We had 2 visiting priests come to our little school in Scotland in 1946. They made such an impression on me, I can still remember the names. They were Father Lumsley Holmes and Father Teasdale. That's how much impact they had. They were amazing men. But they were a catch team. There was 2 of them. Good guy, bad guy. Hellfire, damnation, and let's have some salvation in here. And one of them came into the classroom one morning and he had an attaché case. Are you working hard enough?
I am really enjoying myself.
He had an attaché case and he came in and he had a bag of candy in his other hand. And he said, if anyone can guess what's in this case, I will give you a bag of candies. And we didn't call them candies, it was just caramels. But so we all tried, we're 6 years old, we're trying to guess what's in the case. And of course, none of us had a clue. And he opened it up. He finally said, okay, I'll show you. So he opened the case, and we were all staring at it. and the sides folded down, and the back folded down, and he picked up this very heavy thing. And he said, "Can anyone tell me what that is?" "No." "Well, it was an altar stone." And he said, "This altar stone, or one exactly the same as it, has been carried around the world by Catholic priests since the beginning of Christianity. Because in those days, a traveling missionary priest never knew where he was going to end up. And he could walk into any hut anywhere in any community and take out this stone, which is blessed and contains the relics of a saint and has been sanctified as an altar stone. And he can put it on any table. The table becomes an altar. The hut becomes a church, and he can say Mass." And I thought, wow, that's magic. So he shared the candies among us, because nobody guessed it. 30-odd years later, I'm talking to a friend of mine about how pissed off I am that nobody can tell me other than, "It's magic." And I said, people see what they expect to see. And I suddenly remembered this priest, so I told him the story. And as I was telling him the story, the little altar stone sits there, and it's got a hole in it into which you can slot a crucifix, right? So he put the crucifix in the hole, and he said, "There you are," and he set up the altar. And I'm telling this story to my buddy, and I suddenly thought, holy shit, that's how they did it. Because I'd been reading about Bishop Germanus of Auxerre, who came over to Britain in the 5th century to debate the English bishops who were following the second great heresy of the Christian church, which was called Pelagianism. And he came over and he debated with all these bishops. He did it in the great theatre at Verulamium, which we now call St. Andrews. It was an amphitheatre that could seat 7,000 people. St. Andrews, not St. Andrews, St. Albans. St. Albans. That was a Freudian slip. This theatre could seat 7,000 people, and it was used as a church in the 5th century. And I suddenly thought, that's how they did it. What he did was punch a hole through the altar stone, and the altar cloth around the table concealed the fact that it was the blade of a sword that was down under there, because people came in expecting to see a cross. It was Lent. All the crosses were covered with purple cloth because Jesus was hanging on the cross at the time. It was Easter weekend. And they came in, they saw the cross. They did not see a sword until the young man that they crowned that day as the new High King of Britain swore to use his cavalry for one purpose, as the defenders of the faith, because the Christian faith was getting wiped out by the Anglo-Saxon invaders. And so Arthur puts his hand on the sword, on the cross, he swears his oath, and then he reverses his grip, and out of the stone, the altar stone, he pulls this huge sword, which was a revolutionary weapon. It was a prototype. And 7,000 people turned to each other and said, "Holy shit, did you see what he did?" And we still talk about it today. That's how I came to start the Skystone. So I knew the ending, then I had to find the beginning. Because I'd been reading something else about meteoric iron and how it contained... I'd been reading about the history of metal and how we came to know it. And in the beginning, in the early days, in the days of antiquity, there was no such thing as stainless steel. The Romans could make steel, but it was an accidental process when they made really hard cutting steel. They didn't know what they were doing. And so sometimes it worked, sometimes it doesn't. But once in a blue moon, somebody would use a carbon tempering technique that enabled the sword, made the blade so hard and so keen that it could cut other swords in half. And again, every one of those swords was regarded as magic. And so I was interested in that, and I thought, okay, there's another thing that says we had bronze, copper, iron, and iron became steel. But where did stainless steel come from? So I went looking for that. And I found out that the hardest steels are made by adding molybdenum in the smelting process. And in the old days, the most common source of molybdenum, because very, very few people knew it or used it, was meteoric iron. And so that's where it came from. And just one thing following another logically, but knowing that there's a great story in there and going looking for it. Whoa. So, did I answer your question? Good. All right. Next. Somebody asked.
No, don't. It's too entertaining, please.
I did.
Okay.
Because you said you don't have a notion of something you'd like to see in historical fiction. But do you have a groan in there of something you see too often and you think, oh no, got another one? How will this be fresh? Or does that not happen in historical fiction?
The question is, to Adrienne, as an editor, does she have a groan inside her when she comes across something that has been done to death and says, oh my God, not again? So.
No, it's not a consideration. If I start reading the first page of the manuscript and I'm transported, I know that readers will be as well. So no, it doesn't. I don't. There's no groaner. There's no groaner.
Yes.
What do you guys, both of you, see as the differences between how men and women might enjoy historical fiction? Because I love the social details, what they wear, what they eat, what they think, thinking about. But is there what are the differences?
I think that that female readers are more forgiving of a 21st century sensibility in a historical female heroine. That they want to see echoes, vestiges of strong, independent, self-actualized women, whether or not that was the case historically, in their characters. And I might hazard a guess that a male readership would be less tolerant of a 21st century sensibility infecting characters of historical basis. What do you think, Jack?
Oh, I think lots. The biggest war I ever had with an editor was over a situation like that, where my protagonist finds himself confronted by a couple of, let's say, hookers who have been trying to get him killed, and he was attacked, and he's killed all the bad guys, and he's just about to burn the place down, and these two women emerge sort of whimpering and naked from the loft. And Merlin, his cousin Merlin, standing beside him, and Uther says, get out of here, because we're going to burn this place down. And one of the women crouches down to pick up her clothes, and he whacks her across the ass with the flat of his sword and says, out now, and be lucky. Well, my editor went ballistic on that one. You can't do that to Uther. You're making him out to be a misogynist. A misogynist? I said, for Christ's sake, he's a 5th century Celtic warrior chief. What the hell do you want? Now that's laying 21st century sensibilities on 5th century characters, and I wouldn't wear it. I won't put up with it. However, on the distaff side, all my major editors have been women. And they have all beaten me senseless at times over how I treat my female characters. Because originally, I used to be, I'm slightly older than all you guys. I used to be what was known as I wrote men's books. I wrote about professional soldiers in the 5th century AD. And my first editor said, you gotta do something for the ladies here, because you're not giving them much. Well, I came up with a female character. I never felt comfortable dealing with female characters, because I'm smart enough to know I can never get inside the female psyche. But I just thought of admirable women that I had known, and And I created a character who emerged throughout the course of 6 novels as the matriarch of the clan Britannicus. And I love her, still do. She became an amazing person because in her were parts of every woman I had admired intellectually as well as physically throughout my life. And she was a very, as you said, she had 21st century sensibilities because she was independent, single-minded, self-confident. But my God, the world was full of them in those days. The entire real estate market of Imperial Rome was run by women. The stock exchange was run by women. There were incredibly wealthy women who were responsible to no man because most of the men they knew were what would be kindly known as chancers in Scotland. But women ruled the roost. And, well, of course you did. I'll never forget, I said when I was a kid, I said something stupid like, my dad's the man of the house. And my mother said to me, yeah, but I'm the boss, but don't tell him. Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, yes, did you want to ask something?
Well, okay, this reminds me of a comment I saw elsewhere about some sort of somebody in medieval times.
Yeah.
Just probably wouldn't even consider the possibility of some sort of democratic egalitarian society, but an aristocrat might have an attitude of noblesse oblige, which would make that person more acceptable to modern sensibilities than
Yeah, that's true. I'm pretty heavily into that in this book that I've just finished and we're now editing. It's dealing with the collapse of the feudal system and the emergence of the European sort of mindset. Philip of France is on the throne in France, and he founded the first nation state in Europe, and Europe was not even Europe in those days, it was called Christendom. So, but that sense of noblesse oblige is what maintained and sustained the entire feudal system for many, many centuries. And the feudal system, of course, grew out of the collapse of the Roman Empire. So, yeah, you could say that sense of noblesse oblige makes these people more acceptable to modern readers. I still think, look, the difference between historical fiction and contemporary life is simply that it happened a long time ago. That's it. Romans, Celts, I don't care which society, on which continent you're dealing with, the fundamental pressures on the ordinary working man were looking after his family, putting a roof over their heads, and keeping them safe. How did you do that in pre-Roman Britain? How did you do it in pre-Saxon Britain? How did you do it in Anglo-Saxon Britain? Same way, same thing, just the externals changed. But the contemporary needs and requirements and imperatives remain unchanging across the centuries. And that's the task of the historical novelist, is to bring it home to people reading today who know nothing about that society. And hopefully you can make it entertaining enough and appealing enough that they can learn from it without wagging your finger and preaching. So, yes.
Jack, have you ever come across a fact that contradicted where you wanted your story to go?
Oh, my God.
A minor one, maybe, that you decided to ignore? Because I know, you know, accuracy is the art of which you do, along with what you do with passion. Have you ever ignored something like, oh, he had 2 brothers, not 2 sisters?
I've made the mistake of forgetting a brother or a sibling, and I've made the mistake of, I've overlooked things, but once I discover them, no way do I ignore it, because there's always some troglodyte hiding under a bush somewhere who's going to leap out and show you chapter and verse. No, you don't ignore it. So it sometimes can mean a very substantial rewrite. I'm trying to think of the instance within this current book where I discovered I had made a very fundamental error. And, pardon?
This was in the 5th century and it was 9th century language or something?
No, I just got my historical fact mixed up. Some character didn't come into play until 15 years after I put him in a position where he was exercising influence, and I realized that. So I had to go back and change it, but it's like dropping a brick into a pond. The ripples just they permeate the entire manuscript. It's a tough thing to do. Yes, Dan?
Kind of a tiny question. Obviously, we don't know this. As far as artistic license that way, what if it's something that's a little gray, like you have a character that would be in an area and you want them to be in a specific spot, and there's not necessarily support that they were in that spot, but you know they were in the area. Artistically, can you just put them there? Is that how much game do you get? I guess maybe as an editor, how much leeway would you say before you're like, well, now I'm questioning your authenticity?
Yeah, anything that makes the reader stop short if they have knowledge and interest in the area in which you're writing. You do not want to pull the reader out of the story in any way. You do not want to give them an opportunity to doubt you in any point of fact. I think it's a very dangerous thing to do.
So, with your readership, I imagine there's a broad spectrum of people who come to read your books.
Yeah.
Some with extensive historical knowledge, some with very little.
Yeah.
So, how do you, as an author, balance the facts and the story in such a way that you can provide enough detail for those who know, and not, so much detail that you drown the people who, don't have?
You know the definition of a bore, do you? Do you know the definition of a bore? Too much detail. Anybody who insists on telling you what a tough time he had removing the plaster from the sole of his foot when he got up this morning, you don't want to be around him too long. So it becomes a matter of, this word keeps resurfacing, craft. The writer's skill is a craft. It is learned like any other craft. And as you are absorbing it, as you're learning it, and as you're practicing it, you learn to develop your own discretionary censorship. And at least I personally, know when there's too much detail. And I'll go back and savage it.
Editors do too, and the comment they use is, your research is showing here. Your research is interfering with the pace of your narrative.
So with somebody who has less of a historical background than, say, Jack, reading the manuscript would then probably be able to see some of those things a little bit easier, even though he's already probably done a really good job of tearing it down.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
My job is to tell the best story of which I'm capable. And in doing that, working and reworking, you pare out. You whittle away all the unnecessary stuff, and you're left with the bare bones of the story. So it really, given that your reader is literate, and sufficiently versatile in the use of the language to understand what it does, the amount of detail you provide can vary widely depending on the importance of the point you're trying to make at a time.
The reason I ask this question is I've read some other historical fiction authors who seem to take it upon themselves to throw in lots of historical words and their meanings throughout the text.
Yeah.
And at times
the research is showing.
A history textbook, and it really detracts from the story. And I put that book down and just said, I'm not going to bother. So that's definitely not the case right now.
Yeah. Wait a minute. Okay. Yes.
I guess I have a question going back to the modern sensibilities thing. Jack, as you said, the life is the same except that it happened a long time ago. There were these independent and that. How much problem do you run into the modern expectation of what history was not being the reality? The perceived error, I think, would be maybe talking about. Where, you run into this where it's like, the character is completely legitimate to the time period, but no one believes it because we have this idea that the past was this terrible place or whatever. How do you deal with that?
I tell them to go to school. Get some education, yeah. No, seriously, I have never encountered that. I really haven't. So I can't respond to it. I guess I'm lucky. Yes?
I don't want to bring away from history too much, but it's going to be history made in September when Scotland hasn't been already.
Gee, excuse me, I don't want to talk about that. I don't gotta say nothing. Huh? If Scotland votes for independence, then Christ help us all. Because the one solid commodity that Scotland will never lack is arrogance. If they think they are going to get the power out of Whitehall and, and disconnect the English power base, forget it. I don't care what they do economically. MI5 will continue to operate within the Scottish government. There's not a doubt in my mind about that. So,
Jack, do you find that with the research that you've done, that having editors who are not as versed in the material, that you get a better end product because they're not bringing the same, as a PhD reader might, while picking it apart, they're actually seeing past your research and your story? Do you find that you get a better feedback when somebody's not as versed with the legend that you're bringing to life?
Yes, very definitely, because my copy editor, Sean Oakey, I don't think his background is historical, but my God, his knowledge of the language is all-embracing. He's astounding. And I'm in awe of that man. So, yeah, he will come back and he'll say, you used a word here that didn't come into existence until the 16th century. You're 200 years out of date. That is valid information. That's valid input. And every time he does that, I think, oops. He has literally changed my writing style over the course of about, I think, 7 novels he's done with me now. I used to say although all the time. I never say although. I say though. And he gave me chapter and verse as a reason. I never say almost. I was almost exhausted. Hey, were you exhausted or were you not? Almost is a nothing word. However, I used to use however all the time. Nowadays, however, I don't. So the influence can be really, really, really strong and really beneficial. So yeah, there's absolutely not a doubt in my mind. Yeah, I love it. I love it. Yeah. Anything else? We've exhausted you. You've exhausted us.
I'm well rested.
Yeah.
You write I heard you say that you're not comfortable writing women, but there was some, I think I'm using the name wrong. Is it Boadicea?
Well, it depends. It's Boadicea or Boudica. Boudica.
I mean, there is a story from England
that
is begging to be written correctly.
Excuse me, it has been written superlatively well by a Canadian author, Pauline Gedge. She wrote a novel back in the early 90s. It's called The Eagle and the Raven, and it's about the confrontation between her and Paulinus, the Roman governor in Britain. And it's the uprising of the Iceni, and they came that close to throwing the English out, or throwing the Romans out of Britain. So it's an amazing book. And she's from Saskatchewan. Yeah. And then there's a British author, too, who did a whole series on Boudica. But I can't remember her name, and her books were not anywhere near as strong as Pauline Gedge's. Oh, do you remember? Do you know who you're talking about? No. Okay. Anyone else? Yes. Good job you're here, you two.
In the details that somebody who knows it would sort of think, oh, that's cute, I've got to put it in, but it doesn't really, if you don't get it, it's short enough that it's not the research showing too bad.
I'm not sure I understood your question. You want to rephrase it?
Well, okay. I think it's something that I thought was really neat in a short story about Hal Patterson.
Yeah.
It's sort of a fantasy where there's this pub that people from all kinds of historical periods and different worlds come into, and the narrator of the story mentions a little conversation he hears when he passes by. And the details of the conversation between these two people are enough that I could recognize them. The names aren't mentioned. They're
Okay.
Junius Brutus and Louis Riel. And I thought, gee, how many people would recognize that?
Yeah. I don't do that with people, but I do it with places. There's a place in Britain called the Old Trip to Jerusalem Inn. It's in the town of Nottingham, and it's dug out of the rock on which Nottingham Castle is built. And it was the gathering place for the knights on the way to the First Crusade, which is where the name comes from, the Old Trip to Jerusalem. And you can't stand upright in it. The ceilings are only like 5'9", and it's got a game in there called the ring game, and it's a big room. It's got an 11-foot ceiling. There's a hook in the middle of it and a length of rope attached to it, and on the end of it is a ring, and there's a bull's horn on the wall. Knights were playing that game in the 10th century, and guys are still playing it today. You just swing the rope, let go of the ring and try and drop it over the end of the bull's horn. That kind of detail I will put into a book, yes, definitely. And anybody who's ever been to the Old Trip to Jerusalem Inn knows what I'm talking about. And can't fault me because the bloody place has been there since the 9th century, you know? Okay, yes.
Favorite Scotch?
My favourite Scotch? The Balvenie.
Really?
How about
I think
that?
Mine too, yeah.
Yeah.
Why? Because it tastes like violets and honey.
Yeah, yes, and you know that after you'd said that, Jackie came along, Jackie Guest, who's at the back there, and she had never drunk Scotch before, so I poured her a little of it, and she tasted it.
Wait.
What?
Careful what you say, my son.
Oh, I beg your pardon. As soon as she tasted it, she said, flowers.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a girl Scotch and it's divine.
It's a beautiful Scotch. Yeah.
Beautiful Scotch. It's called Balvenie.
It's the double-wooded Balvenie. It's stored for the first period of time in oak wood casks, and then it is restored again for a couple of years in sherry wood casks.
I was first introduced to Balvenie by the novelist Guy Gabriel Kay. I have to give credit where credit is due.
Yeah, good. I didn't know he was a Scotch drinker.
He's very much a Scotch drinker.
Oh, well, okay. Got to see him again.
All my authors must drink Scotch.
Okay. Yes, my dear. Sorry.
Can you tell me where you get your research? Do you have any favorite places where you get your
When I was doing my trilogy on the Knights Templar, I really needed to do some in-depth research. And I had a friend, she is Jewish, and she's an academic, and she lives in the United States. And I got talking to her, and she's an expert on the Templars. But she writes about the Templars in French. But she put me in touch with a man who... he was... I can't describe how powerful he was. He's a Trappist monk, and he is the librarian in a Trappist monastery in the south of France. And he's under a vow of permanent silence. He can't talk, but boy, can he write, you know? And he's the archivist for this 9th century monastery. And she had used him, she had met him and used him for 2 of her medieval mysteries. And she put me in touch with him. She wrote to him and said, I have this friend who is investigating the Knights Templar, and would you be willing to help him? And I got an email from him saying yes. So I used to send him the email, and nothing would happen for about a month, and then all this stuff would come back. It was like Santa Claus climbing down a chimney. And it was magnificent, but I never spoke to the man, never met him. So the thing about the best research you can ever do is to cultivate the staff of the humanities division in your local public library. You'll never find a better source. Because these people are bibliophiles, and they will go and they'll do a ton of work on your behalf if you interest them in the first place. And they'll go and dig it all out, and then they'll give you chapter and verse, and then it's up to you to do the reading and the research. The internet, unless you know where you're going, unless you have very, very definite instructions as to where to look, it can be a waste of time. Wikipedia, avoid it as you would the plague. Wikipedia is monumentally untrustworthy because anybody can go in and change any record at any time, and nobody seems to vet them, which is a shame, but it's the truth. I don't think there's anything more I can say. What about you? No. Thank you very much. Thank you. I enjoyed your gig last night,